Welcome back to the Heralds of History channel. Do you like stories of magnitude, personal triumph, deceit, drama, and just so happen to have the fate of Europe at stake? Well, if you do, you've come to the right place. On today's episode, we'll be exploring one of the most pivotal times in Western history, the Mongol invasion of Eastern Europe. And I think there's no better way to do that than by following the life of King Béla IV. Béla IV's story is underpinned by treachery, murder, humiliation, and defeat before rising to one of resolve, leadership, and learning from one's mistakes. I'd like to start off this episode by asking a question, and I really want you to think about this. Let's close our eyes and teleport back to the 1200s. Let's imagine that, by chance of birth, you're the ruler of millions of people on a border state with the ever expanding Mongol Empire. By now, your spies and courtiers have told you tales for some years now about the fall of China, of Persia, and really, to be quick about it, most of Asia. You've heard stories of vast armies that move as fast as a racing river and are as brutal as any nomadic barbarians you have encountered thus far. Now, you may think it's simple: find their weaknesses, exploit their divisions, create logistical nightmares, prepare your armies and your food stores, and that would be prudent enough. But now, let's say your own vassals have begun to turn against you, undermining you at every chance they get, purposely slowing recruitment and weapon shipments, ignoring orders, and sowing discontent. How do you fight the fiercest army in the world, to this date, has never been stopped, while you also fight enemies within? That's the question that Béla IV had to solve, and our topic on today's episode of Heralds of History. In 1241, Béla stood with his army at Mohi, a site that he had chosen to defend on a high hill next to a river that had a bridge that he could closely guard. Leading up to this battle, a few key events had played out. Firstly, Béla had, for years, taken tighter and tighter reins on power, reducing that of his vassals, putting them at odds with his rule. Many vassals sought to hurt his ability to fight the Mongols as best and as subtly as they could, such as delaying food shipments or men. Béla was surely aware of this, though, and had for some time now made a contingency plan by settling the Cuman people in the vast eastern expanse of Hungary, to sort of act as a shield or a rapid response force to any invading nomads, primarily the Mongolians. Reports of the initial Mongol crossing into Hungary spread quickly throughout the land, though, with numerous reports that Cumans had been spotted in the Mongol horde, sending the native Hungarians into a panic, thinking that there was an enemy within. They exacted unexpected and fierce attacks on the Cumans, thus driving the Cumans from their side, dealing a great blow to Béla's plans to defend his borders. These were unforced errors, and when fighting against arguably the greatest military mind in the Mongol Empire, Subutai, you couldn't afford to make such mistakes. For years now, Subutai had been planning his invasion of Europe, sending spies and gathering intel. He would have surely known about the feuding between the great houses, the Cuman settlement, the subsequent self-expulsion. All of these things worked heavily in Subutai's favor, and now the time was right to strike and push deeper into Europe. So Béla, gathering what forces he could, assembled a large army at Mohi on the Sejo River, resolved to face the Mongols head-on. The Hungarians were alerted to a potential night crossing and rushed to the nearby bridge, where they beat back the Mongol army contingent, with a large number drowning in the river as they tried to retreat. The Hungarians, thinking this may have been the main army, rejoiced, but soon another Mongol sortie was attempting to cross the bridge, this time larger and bringing with them Batu, the commander of the main army and a grandson of the great Genghis Khan himself. Here, the battle was furious. Many Mongols lost their lives, including 30 of Batu's most experienced, battle-hardened bodyguards. It was only after the great strategic architect, Subutai, the true leader of this Mongol army, had crossed the river some ways down by building a pontoon bridge that Batu and the rest of his men were saved. If the Hungarians could have beaten back or defeated Batu before Subutai's reinforcements, the Battle of Mohi may have been remembered as a great defense against Mongol attack, and really one of the first major battles that the Mongols had lost. But fate would not have it so. Mohi would come to be remembered as the deathbed of Hungary, a total and complete defeat that would take years to come back from. Soon, Subutai forced the Hungarians back to their makeshift hill fort, created by wagons they had erected in a circle. What they thought stood as a fortress ultimately stood as a killing field for Mongolian arrows that rained down on the tightly formed Hungarians. Subutai, in another masterstroke, knew that he would rather face an army that was routing than one who knew they had to fight to the death. So, on his orders, a column opened up in the Mongolian line, one big enough to tempt the Hungarians out of their makeshift fort. Once out in the plain, it was a slaughter. The entire army routed and either was put to the sword or enslaved. By chance, Béla and his bodyguard were able to make it out and flee through the Hungarian countryside. With one fell swoop, Béla had lost his main army in a total rout, and seemingly his kingdom with it. The Mongols were soon wise to the fact that Béla had indeed escaped. Mongol doctrine stated that as long as the ruler of the kingdom was still alive, their land was not yet truly conquered. Thus, the chase was on. Béla fled west to his neighbor, Duke Frederick of Austria. Here is where Duke Frederick gets his name, the Quarrelsome, as he initially treats with Béla only to lure him into imprisonment, stating that Béla owed him some money for some frivolous, potentially made-up reason. Béla becomes the Duke's prisoner, and only after agreeing to pay a large sum, along with granting land on Hungary's border with Austria, was he allowed to leave. But as luck would have it, in the dead of winter, the Mongols were furiously continuing their chase after Béla and getting closer and closer. This time of the year allowed the Mongols to sprint across frozen rivers, reducing their time to target immensely. The Mongols chased Béla and his men all the way to the Adriatic, where tales say that the Mongols could see Béla in a rowboat sailing across the channel to an island called Tigr. The Mongols attempted to lay siege or, by one way or another, infiltrate Tigr, but Béla was able to repel initial attacks. It was only the death of the great Khan, Ogadai, that paused the siege. Mongol tradition stated that all princes of the blood were to be present for the election of the next Khan. The leader of the siege happened to be a prince, along with Batu Khan, who was still ravaging Hungary. Their forces subsequently swung east, back to Mongolia, to settle the succession. What had been horrible luck thus far for Béla suddenly turned in his favor, just when he needed it the most. From here, Béla traveled back to his ravaged Hungary. Much of the east was deserted or burned to the ground. It's here where Béla would make the most critical decision of all. Instead of lamenting in his sorrow or electing to simply rebuild, he chose to reform. He looked at everything that went wrong leading up to and during the Mongol invasion and vowed to never let it happen again. He noted in the first wave, the Mongols were almost unmatchable in flat terrain, but in the woods, or even better, the mountains, they were ill-equipped and could be dealt with much easier. He also noticed that while armed with siege equipment, the Mongols were not well prepared to handle long sieges, particularly against stone castles. So, Béla reformed the law to allow his vassals to build castles of their own. No longer were all the castles directly under the crown, thus encouraging a large number of fortresses to be built. Béla also sought to reform the army, particularly by expanding knighthood for trained and professional fighting men. Béla also convinced many Germans, Poles, and Jews to settle in Hungary, essentially negating the loss of his population experienced in the first Mongol wave. What's more is that Béla convinced the Cumans to return, offering the marriage of his son and heir to be wed to the daughter of a Cuman warlord. The Cumans once again offered an impressive obstacle to any future Mongol invasion. In the years after the Mongol invasion, they sent many emissaries to Béla with notes to surrender, at one point offering to leave Hungary as a kingdom if they pledged their men and ranks for their push deep into Europe. Béla would have none of it. He seemed to want a rematch he had for years now prepared for. Sadly, his next enemy would come from an unexpected place, his own son. The son I mentioned before that was pledged to marry a Cuman warlord's daughter, his name was Stephen. Stephen had been made ruler of Transylvania, but in recent years had grown suspicious of his father's intentions and began to speculate that his own father would soon attempt to disinherit him. What's next is a tragic tale of son against father. Stephen rallies his forces and faces his father in battle after battle. Eventually, the archbishops of each side help them to come to some sort of resolution that effectively cements the status quo and Stephen's eventual ascension to the throne. This is exactly the type of infighting that hurt the Hungarian defenses some years ago, and Béla couldn't afford to make the same mistakes again, for he knew that soon the Mongols would return. King Béla IV died in 1270, before knowing what the full extent of his reforms and defensive preparations would mean for his kingdom. Likewise, his son Stephen would soon succumb as well after only 2 years on the throne, leaving his young son, Ladislaus, to be their heir to the throne. Now, remember that some time ago, Stephen was to be wed to a Cuman woman. Well, Ladislaus was the child of that marriage, a true symbol of the forming of their two people, now under one crown. Ladislaus, it seems, tended to prefer his Cuman side, and disregarded or completely ignored many Hungarian traditions, although his powerful vassals tried to keep him in check. They all knew that the Mongols were to return, and it would take a combined effort to prevent the same result as last time. It's important to note here that many of the people now living at the time of Ladislaus's rule were not present during the Mongol invasion. They were either refugees, settlers, or children of those who had managed to escape Mongol desolation. It's now 1285, and no one has seen a Mongol in Hungary for 43 years, but their looming terror grew in myth as everyone waited for the other shoe to drop. The thing is, no matter what stories you tried to tell about the Mongols, the reality was almost always worse. They did take people's ears and wear them around their necks. They did slaughter innocent men and women at will. They did torture people in the most gruesome ways imaginable. The Hungarians knew the horrors of what would come if they did not win their next fight, and soon they would be tested again. Now, it's important to mention here that the line of Béla cannot help messing up. Ladislaus was getting in major trouble with literally everyone, so much so that he had a crusade called against him from his own archbishop. Many Hungarians speculated that he even invited the Mongols to Hungary, which is highly debated and probably not true. His vassals hated him. He was at war with the church, and the Cumans, who he seemed fond of, had soured on him after a rebellion. So Ladislaus is essentially useless here, to be honest. But this does give us a chance to view the reforms by Béla to be put to the test directly. No help from a charismatic or strategic figurehead, just reforms, fortresses, and local powerful vassals who would use these tools in the battles to come. The moment would come in 1285, when Nogai and Tubunga led two separate columns in the winter, much like the invasion in 1241. But this time, the Hungarians would not fight like how the Mongols were used to. The first disaster came to Tubunga, who faced perilous winter storms, made worse by Béla's network of castles, which hoarded food and protected local inhabitants. In fact, the fortresses were such an obstacle, no castles would be captured during this campaign. Meanwhile, local rulers continued to harass Mongolian detachments, further causing deaths. In the east, Nogai's column was continuously harassed by the Hungarians under Roland Borsa, with a large portion of his army made up of the Saxon and Polish settlers in the area who came under Béla's rule. The castles built made local sorties possible, and essentially, rather than having one battle to settle things, they elected to deny the Mongols of what they needed by storing their food, bringing inhabitants inside the castle, and continuously harassing Mongol scout and raiding columns. Eventually, it was too much, and the Mongols decided to cut their losses, but it's here where the true defeat of the Mongols came, as the retreating Mongols were set upon by local peoples as they made their way out of the country. Not only had the Mongols been defeated, but resoundingly so. As for Béla's line, it would end with Ladislaus. He had grown too close to the Cumans, so much so that the Pope himself ended up calling for a crusade on him, wanting to install Charles Martel on the throne. Ladislaus was chased all over Hungary before being assassinated by the very people that he had grown close to, the Cumans. And so, even though Béla's line had ended here, his reforms did work, and quite possibly had saved Europe. And seemingly nobody had really given him credit for this, and it's someone we really don't hear too much about. And it's not one of these, shimmering figures of chivalric nobility or anything like that. Béla had a lot of problems, as you can see by, going to war with his own child and then his grandchild, having a crusade called upon him from his own archbishop and then the Pope himself. So there's a lot of things here that, we can point to and say maybe he wasn't the best character of history to really point as an archetype, right? But in the end, the impact of these reforms are so immense. I mean, we can only imagine what would have happened if the Mongols were able to pushed their way westward into Europe, where would they have stopped? That's a question we don't have to really think about because Bela's reforms did work, and they stopped the Mongols dead in their tracks on the eastern part of Europe. And it's really a story of such resolve and belief in oneself and adaptability to change as the times need you to. And so, with that, we conclude another fascinating episode of Heralds of History. I hope you're enjoying these. I plan to create many more in the future. If there's any topics that you would like us to cover, please comment those down below, and I will see you on the next one.